I'm Zach Walker. This is another episode of the DIU-ex podcast. Today I am joined by Dr. Bernadette Johnson, our first and only Chief Science Officer for DIUx. Bernadette, thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. I don't know if I like being the only, if that's a good sign or a bad sign, but it's really nice to see you again, Zach, and I'm looking forward to talking. What I thought I would do first is talk a little bit about my background and where and sort of what the circumstances were when I first heard about DIUx and why I so wanted to join this particular enterprise. So at the time, I was the Chief Technology Officer at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. And as such, it was my job to manage the research portfolio for all our internal investments. So this would be, maybe $50 million-ish worth of very early stage foundational research that would have advanced capabilities when and if they matured to the point of transition. We invented a lot of things, a lot of very good things. We did a lot of transition to military systems. But we had the constant sense that a lot of technology we developed was just not leaving the laboratory. It either wasn't what people exactly wanted, it was either too expensive, too whatever. It didn't have the commercial utility that we thought. And as a federally funded laboratory, it's very important for us to be mindful that our technology transfer mandate is not just to support national security, but also economic competitiveness. So I had for a while been really curious how the world outside of the lab worked once you got research products. And I'd say that's a sentiment a lot of my colleagues share. We just don't know much about that world. So when we heard of the formation of Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, seemed pretty exciting. We tracked its development and its launch in Silicon Valley. And again, that seems very far away from Boston in terms of how things are done and the entire interaction with the private equity and venture funding community was just foreign. So fast forward to winter of 2015, Ash Carter announced that he was going to open a satellite office in the Boston area. And I went literally the next day to the director of the lab and said, I really want to be part of that. But, full transparency, I do have a job here. So what do you think? And he said, go for it. And so I contacted Carter's office and went down and met with folks in early 2016 in the Pentagon. I gave them a briefing for what I thought the Boston office could do and be all about. And around the same time, I think he was interviewing Raj Shah. And Raj was selecting a leadership team. And by the spring of 2016, I had contacted Raj and said, I would love to be part of or actually run your Boston office, at least from the technology perspective. My hope was that I might learn some skills that would be really germane to getting government-funded technology out into the commercial sector, but also to support making those technologies available to the military, because that is the other half of this, that the government wants to be able to buy things, not necessarily always go to the same labs or contractors. So by the summer of 2016, I had arranged for something called an IPA, and that's where essentially universities and private entities or non-for-profits will loan people to the government for a fixed time. It's usually 2 years, sometimes can be up to 4. I signed on as an IPA and started on August 1st as the first member of the Boston office. I was joined a few weeks later by then newly minted Colonel Mike McGinley, who was the second member. And together we strategized crafting a DIUx version that was tailored to the Boston innovation ecosystem, which is a little bit different from Silicon Valley. So in essence, I just want to make clear, I heard of it. I sought it out. I really wanted to be part of it. And I hoped always to bring what I learned back into the R&D world that I typically inhabit.
It's a great story. Certainly not unlike a lot of the early DIUx folks, right? There was no such thing as DIUx in a lot of ways. You kind of had to figure out how to join it, which I think really meant that the people you got
I had
in
to find
DIUx,
somebody who knew somebody.
Yeah. The people that were there, they wanted to be there and they figured it out, which really speaks to lot of that early work. Now you came on as our first and only, I guess, at this point, chief science officer, and wondering if you could say why chief science officer, why not CTO like you had been at Lincoln?
Well, I felt one thing I noticed when I looked at the very, very new activities of DIUx and Raj's plan was that there was a missing ingredient, and the missing ingredient was strong domain knowledge in some of the technical areas that DIUx was likely to be asked to dive into. So what we had were very creative thinkers and excellent program managers, people with moderate technical backgrounds, stronger in cybersecurity, and a couple folks very, very strongly. But mainly, it seemed that the early DIUx was about training program managers and training people in the art of flexible contracting, and in the art of the deal and in pitches, all of which I wanted to learn. But I felt like there was a yin to that yang, and that was technical expertise. So I wanted to both give the organization the technical credibility of having a chief science officer, but also promote, my own goals within DIUx to grow a stronger technical core. And that was part of the pitch I made when I joined. And when I gave that title, they were completely agreeable, so we just stuck with it. As you said, in those days, we were making this up as we went along, and that seemed reasonable to most people at the time.
And CTOs also tend to have a very IT heavy focus, right?
They
So you're
do,
going to
and
get people selling you printers and servers.
yeah, I did tease Raj a little bit. I said, please just don't call me CTO again, because I'm tired of getting hit on by Dell salespeople and trying to sell me some IT capability. But really, it also was some thought about what the composition of the core could look like or could evolve into that had me think that.
Yeah, and that again over the last couple of years that's changed a bit. Certainly with the move to the undersecretary for R&E, certainly a bigger focus on science. But back in 2016, it was very much we need MBAs, we don't need PhDs necessarily. And I'd love for your perspective on this idea of a technical versus a business workforce.
Well, I think the ideal situation would have strong people in both. Um, what I found when I went to DIUx is the typical model of a government person will come to DIUx with a problem. A program manager will find companies that work in that area, and there will be this beautiful marriage. The finding companies was something I didn't have any experience in, but the understanding the government problems is something that is what we do in the research labs, and especially in the defense lab enterprise. We take what the agency thinks their problem is, and we turn it around and say, actually, this is what you need, or that's what you need. So absent technical expertise, you can only give the customer exactly what they ask for, not so much what they might actually need to solve the problem. So I think that's one place the technical core helps. The other is, to be honest, in the understanding what the companies are trying to sell you. So I think that one of the biggest cultural shifts for me was the fact that there was no expectation that companies would have to explain their technology in any great detail when they were pitching to DIUx. They would talk about the founders, the investors, the runway, the vision, the facilities sometimes, the resources, but hardly ever deep dive into the tech. So that was completely new to me. Like at the end of every briefing, I would think, well, all right, but how does it work? So I felt that a little injection of that probably would have completed this picture a lot more. But I was pleasantly surprised also to see how much technical vetting gets done in the funding world. So, if a VC had vetted a company, chances are they did have a PhD or two that was looking into the technology. And so that was part of the learning experience for me, is that it's not all about the money, and it's not all about the founders. But I think at DIUx, I hoped it could be more about the tech.
Well, at the end of the day, a VC will make an investment if they think the company will be successful business side, right? There are many companies that have good technical products that just aren't successful for a variety of reasons that you get into if you buy an MBA degree. But certainly, that's a very different calculus when determining if something will be successful in the government, right? Because the best laid business plan may not survive first contact with the program office.
Yeah, and I think another way of looking at that is many times what the warfighter needs has no obvious commercial counterpart or value, right? We're not necessarily looking at the highly encrypted communication devices, for example, in the commercial sector. So you have to appreciate that an entire company's business model, which would be to make lots of money, that just doesn't always work. Now, I know what DIUx really focused on were those technologies with strong dual use aspects. I think that's smart because it would be the commercial investment that would essentially, um, you know, allow or enable the military capability. But those are hard to find. And I think that's what maybe the first year or two of the DIUx ramp up was finding what is the market segment we're going after, and what is the customer segment we're trying to please, and how do you marry these different needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the super high encryption, right? And there are definitely military applications for that, but certainly any bank, anyone that's trying to secure their data would also be interested. And there's always that bit of that, what you speak to earlier, the chicken or the egg of the technology that doesn't have a business case necessarily versus the really good business case that may be lacking on technology. And I'd like to do a bit of segue, really getting to your expertise and understanding that whole spectrum of the technology readiness level and trying to get a better sense of what you think the relationship is between federal labs, with FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers, and DIU, what the relationship is, maybe what the relationship should be.
Sure. I think that what I saw at DIUx was, if you're familiar with the technology readiness level scale, they would mostly target maybe TRL 6 and give a company enough funding to get it to TRL 9. So, like literally where you could buy it. So, but it had to have proven itself in some reasonable capacity. The labs, on the other hand, tend to work at the basic and applied research level to the maybe lab or field demonstrated, sometimes even demonstrated in operational environments, but more the TRL 4 and 5 is the output of a lot of the federal labs. So, to the question of how DIU could work more holistically with the federal labs, there are problems that the government needs solving that have mature and business ready solutions there. I think that's what DIUx started out to find those, and they did a great job, or almost there. So I'll say COTS, commercially available or near COTS. But there are problems that don't have commercial solutions yet, but they could with just a little more refinement. And I think partnering with the federal labs and the defense lab enterprise is a great way to grow that particular strength. In other words, take earlier seed work coming out of the labs and get it working in companies and then rapidly back into military hands. And that's actually the part that excited me the most, I think, because I saw a lot of TRL4 stuff just never go anywhere because we didn't know where to take it. We, speaking from the lab perspective. And I think DIUx could really serve that function quite a bit now.
So it sounds like you're talking about the valley of death, which is a very insidious thing where we have amazing technology, perhaps not unlike a cyber grand challenge that gets demonstrated, and then the government just walks away because we don't have that team of MBAs that can then go build a business plan and take it to market and get venture investment and the patient capital that may be needed for some of these things. So are there other parts of the government? So what comes to mind is the SBIR program, billions of dollars a year to try to bridge that valley of death. Do you think that's something that is not being leveraged as well as it could? Is that something that DIU should be more involved in, or do you think that there's a third solution that helps bridge that gap so you can get from maybe 4 to 6, 4 to 7?
Yeah, so it's a good question is how much could DIU be involved in developing small companies by also perhaps leveraging or greater awareness or complementarity to the SBIR programs. So It's an interesting question. I think many of the small companies that you might see out in Silicon Valley would be inclined to think that their goal is to get seedling funds and Series A's and B's and all from investors. They're not really thinking as much about looking for government contracts, especially not these small awards. However, depending on where you live geographically, and I'm guessing, Zach, in Texas, you see it differently. We certainly see it differently in Boston. The sea of small business opportunities via government contracts is actually more valued. And what we have found is that it can tend to give credibility to small companies who are seeking private or investor funding. So I think we saw that at DIUx early on with more than one company that an investor subsequently, a VC subsequently put in significant seedling dollars after seeing the interest in DIUx. So you could imagine DIU magnifying that using the SBIR STTR program.
You have the scale spectrum 1 through 9. You have the different values of death. There is not a single DoD entity or federal government entity that is responsible for taking these companies, these very promising companies, to go from basic and applied research all the way to finished product. It's just a series of these off ramps and valleys of death. And it sounds like you're speaking to possibly DIU serving more of that role, where it is the defense innovation unit. It is the organization that's responsible for finding the best technology, no matter where it is, and finding the right investors and making those matches happen.
Yeah, I think you just said it very well, which is again, and I'll contrast this to where I sat in the R&D world. If a government sponsor came to us with a problem, we would know what the state of the art was in the universities. We would know what the other labs were doing. We would know what we could do. We hardly ever looked to ask, well, I wonder what's in the commercial sector, because the assumption was, well, they wouldn't come to us if you could buy it. In fact, yeah, you shouldn't. That's what the FFRDCs were stood up to provide that service. But when I got to DIUx, it was really interesting because I did all those things, but then also looked to see, all right, well, what's in the commercial sector, and was, I think, probably surprised. This is just, my own narrow bias, but, I think, as I mentioned to you once before, those same PhDs that we were trying to hire at the lab were going to these startups. It's the same labor pool, the same bright people, and also some really terrific ideas that you might not see in labs. So what DIU could be is, the idea is they are the problem solvers, or at least one line of problem solving for the military. And to your point, it doesn't matter if the technology is less mature and still in a lab, then help get it out, or in a startup, then help grow that startup, or even if it's in a traditional defense contractor base. Well, then that's a different funding model, but still that's valid. And I liked that DIU could play across those spaces, but in the beginning, of course, it was kind of focused in the middle.
Absolutely. I'd like to move a bit to talk about the regional aspect of the initial plan for DIUx.
Yeah.
And so I'll share a little bit later with the audience some of your initial plan that you pitched in I think March of 2016, about having the plan was different DIUx offices in different areas that had a focus and had something to offer. And you had one takeaway from the slide that I thought was particularly great. And it's not about just being present, but actually having a focus in the region and actually being a player in the regions that we're in. And love if you could speak to specifically in the East, DIUx East in Boston.
Yeah, I think you just said it very well, which is, again, and I'll contrast this to where I sat in the R&D world.
Office in Boston,
if a government sponsor came to us with a problem, so I won't pretend to speak for what Ash Carter had in mind, but I'm going to guess. And I did have a chance to, sort of bat this idea around in the Pentagon before joining DIUx. There was a sense, first of all, Silicon Valley was chosen because it is where you go to access venture funding, as well as this innovative, creative, kind of novel way of doing business. So it really represented, I think, a difference from the standard acquisition cycles that we even better, what is it now? Better buying power 3.0 by the time I think Kendall left. It really would be something different. But by the same token, there are other regional innovation centers around the country, and they were growing, even then, even 5 years ago, that had either different cultures or different technical areas. So when I heard they were coming to Boston, what I thought was, well, there's a few things Boston does really well. One, it already has a very strong DoD presence. There are DoD laboratories, bases, FFRDCs, more than one, a few defense contractors, strong ROTC presence in the universities, and essentially a culture that prides itself on being patriotic. So I don't think any of us in Boston thought for a minute we would run into the I'm not sure I want to work for the DoD. That's just one difference. The other is the number of universities, which meant with nominally 100 universities within a 50-mile radius, we could really pull the latest, greatest, hottest technologies out of labs and see them as they're forming into startups and get access. So that was pretty darn exciting. And then I think there's just the fact that Boston was at the time the number 2 growing VC investment, city in the country. New York is now about number 2, I think, still below Silicon Valley. But now, we like to think of ourselves in the Northeast, so we like to sum Boston and New York together. So you would argue that there is a comparable amount of investment dollars floating around on the East Coast as on the West Coast. But by the same token, there are plenty of other places, Austin, Texas being one, Detroit being one, Dayton, Ohio, Birmingham, Alabama, Virginia. They're all over the country. Innovation centers are thriving, and many of them are co-located near laboratories, bases, or DoD-centered facilities. So the idea is, why not populate the country with, I don't know, couple dozen of these nodes, so you have ready access to this entire ecosystem.
You've gone back to Lincoln Lab. You're now the Chief Technology Ventures Officer, so presumably doing some.
Yeah, another title I made up and people agreed to. So
that's a great one. That's a great one. No one knows what to sell you, whether they want to sell you ideas or printers or maybe both.
Well, yeah, it's true. I think one of the things that I didn't want to run an Office of Technology Transfer, because within the DoD, that can be a pretty scripted an understanding of what that is. It's like licensing. We have a good Office of Technology Transfer at MIT, and Lincoln is part of MIT, so there was no reason to duplicate that function. But this whole idea of bringing companies into the laboratory, to Lincoln Laboratory, to help do our sponsored research, as well as creating pipelines for getting tech out, that's kind of what I learned to do a little bit at DIU that I wanted to bring back, and that's what I've been doing ever since. In fact, very shamelessly watched what DIU was doing with the commercial solutions opening, saw the pilot program that was launched nationally, and even though we're not a federal, we're not a government agency, we're not a government lab, we're MIT employees, we adapted and created a version of that, which I've run about 12 of them in the last year and a half of CSOs, including using the word. It turns out that was okay. We checked. But it's allowing us to do things, for example, like invite people to submit white papers and give pitches and bypass the old, DFARS and FAR-based acquisition processes that we used to use for source selection. So it's been pretty, there's been some favorable language even outside of DIU in the DFARS, in clauses that are intended to favor non-traditional defense contractors. And so, whereas I might not have known about those, I now track them, and whenever anything new happens, that's new permissions, we make sure they flow down to us as well, and we start using them. So, that's one lab, but I talk to my peers at the other FFRDCs and UARCs, the university affiliated, and everybody's trying to do the same thing, trying to engage more with the commercial sector and sort of prove more or create a better pipeline for transition of technologies into the commercial sector as well. So
that's great to hear. In addition to creating new mechanisms that you can eventually borrow, what else could DIU do to help not only Lincoln but other entities like yours, especially when it comes to, let's say, private money?
Well, I think the first one I mentioned already. I feel much more comfortable when a reputable VC tells me they have vetted a company, that they have vetted it in a bunch of domains that I don't fully understand, but in the ones that I do, meaning the technical competency. I'm also aware that many really, really good technical ideas don't have any commercial utility in their eyes. And so that's a shame, that the technology may not be the first thing on the list that they use when they're evaluating the potential business success. But that's a good thing to know. And as a result, I have a comfortable network of a half a dozen or so VCs in the Northeast that I can contact whenever we're looking for companies that might be able to help solve a problem. Some of them I met directly through DIU, and some of them I continue to make. But I understand the world a little more. I'm more comfortable in it, and flow a little more freely. Um, I think the other main thing I learned, well, maybe two more things, and don't want to monopolize the conversation. One is understanding what the customer's needs are. In DIU's case, the customer is a government sponsor, a government funding entity. They often think they know, I want this box. It's got to be 6 inches by 10 inches by whatever. But what they really want is a 24-hour surveillance system. They getting them to talk a little bit more about what they want and finding out if what they're really looking for couldn't be met in some other way. I hope I did that as a scientist, but I feel like I do that more now. And then maybe the final thing that really appealed to me was the speed. I liked that decisions were made quickly. There were a lot of things done that I would have called maybe on instinct or intuition, instead of full engineering analyses. And the reality is that I found at DIUx that things just moved so much faster. And if you got it wrong, you figured out what went wrong and didn't try that again. The penalty for failing was, I didn't even see any, to be honest. Maybe a postmortem on, what could we have done differently. But I found that to be really invigorating and probably needed in the research community as well.
So the one last thing I wanted to pick your brain on is, we had chatted earlier, and you had talked about the case for DIU to marry up Department of Defense money, private money. Certainly, we have this national security innovation capital effort that we've been trying to get off the ground. Just wondering if you could maybe speak to that from your perspective in an FFRDC, what that would mean for the Department of Defense as well as labs and industry, if we could do a better job of that.
Yeah, it's part of what DIUx's original rationale was. Look at all this commercial funding. Look at where the federal funding is. One outpaces the other 3-1, and then some. So let's leverage all this commercial money. I think that's a big global picture. It's still true, but it doesn't really tell the story. The story is, if there are advanced technologies that could help the military that also have commercial utility, then those partnerships start to make a lot of sense. So, a commercial entity might be comfortable ramping up a fabrication capability if it knows it's going to have a $100 million DoD contract. But it's going to be really excited if it knows there's a subsequent $1 billion in commercial sales that are enabled. So understanding not just, I built it for this, but I can use it for that, but rather what the full potential market scope is and which side should leverage which. I mean, there's plenty of times, let's say in telecommunications, where the military might as well just leverage the commercial investment. But there are things that the military research could inject into the commercial chain that would give us global competitiveness, maybe 2 or 3 years ahead of our peer competitors in the world. So I think that as DIU matures, one of the really important things would be to look at a much bigger scale, not just one-on-one problem solving, but how do we take that DoD investment in research with the DoD needs, with the commercial available investment, and wrap them together to grow new advanced capabilities that just might not happen organically. One thing that makes me cringe when I read this, I think it was just last year, the amount of money, dry powder left on the table in 2019 by the VC community because arguably they couldn't find enough good things to invest in. I basically want to have a meeting with them and say, look, you guys are risk takers. Take some risks here. So here meaning in the DoD or in the labs or for the government. It doesn't necessarily have to be for DoD, although that is what DIU is for. I think it's a matter of getting these folks to meet together, maybe now virtually for a while, but understanding the big potential scope, I think could be something DIU would be very good at and it would be really welcome.
Well, Bernadette, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences and your ideas, and thanks for what you're doing at Lincoln and what you certainly did in the early days of DIUx.
It was a great experience. I met wonderful people, and I really wish it continued success.